Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring two guests at the same time. It's always lovely when that happens. I'm talking with Lundberg-Kenrick and his son, David Kenrick. Douglas is the author of The Rational Animal. He has published many scientific articles and books in various chapters. He's also, his textbook, Social Psychology, Goals and Interaction, is now in its 7th edition. He's appeared in many places, New York Times, Scientific American. I also have on the podcast with him is his son, David Kenrick. He's the Media Outreach Director for Arizona State University Psychology Department. And he has a background in film. And he's also the co-author of Social Psychology, Goals and Interaction, which again is in its 7th edition. They are the co-authors of the newest book, Solving Modern Problems with a Stone Age Brain, Human Evolution and the 7 Fundamental Motives. And it is fantastic. And so I was very, very happy to get both of them together to talk about the book. We start by talking about how they have a pyramid of needs. And how it's rooted in evolution. And there's some juxtaposition there between Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We talk about evolution mismatches and tradeoffs. We talk about behaviorism a little bit and how certain behaviorism techniques such as stimulus control can help aid in managing various behaviors for adaptive change. We talk about ascendant tribalism and problems of dehumanization and bad incentives, particularly online. Talk about the role of friendships and many of the pro-social aspects of friendship. And we talk about the impact of prestige and dominance. We also talk about dating and the romantic aspects of interpersonal relationships. And then we also talk about the evolving ideas on the family and how this has been and where this is going kind of in the future. And so both of them were fabulous to talk to. They have a really nice chemistry. It's a kind of father-son duo, and it's really, really nice. And you'll see in some parts of the conversation, or I say large parts of the conversation, it's very conversational between the three of us, which is really, really nice. And some of it's just kind of some thinking out loud, which is also very nice. So it's not a strict interview. There's pieces of that, but we all got along very well, and it was really, really nice to have some of that conversational aspects, and it was just a joy to have them. And so I now bring you Douglas and David Kenrick. I'm here with Douglas and David Kenrick. Welcome both to the podcast. It's wonderful to have both of you on.
Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah. So before we get into your wonderful book, just tell two things. Tell folks who you are, what you do, your background, what you study, and then how you guys work together as a kind of as a duo. Just briefly tell us the story behind that.
Okay, I'll let you start, Dave.
Okay, well, so I'm Dave Lundberg-Kenrick. I work at the ASU Department of Psychology, where I was the media outreach program manager. Now I'm creative director. I work on this program called Psych for Life, where we basically working on a web-based platform to show people how to use psychology in their day-to-day lives. And then I also co-host the Zombified podcast with Dr. Athena Actipis, where we talk about all the things that may be manipulating us, from disease to technology to cultural factors. And and then I'll let my dad, who is right across the hall, go next.
I'm Doug Kenrick. I'm a social psychologist who has considered a lot of aspects of human social behavior in the context of evolutionary biology. What can we learn about ourselves from studying what are the universals and variations across human cultures? What do we have in common with, and how are we different from other animal species? And in that context, I've studied everything from love to aggression, prejudice, and various aspects of social cognition, thinking. I've been around for a while, studied a lot of different topics in social psychology. We actually both co-author a social psychology textbook with Bob
nice.
Cialdini and Steve Newberg as well.
Oh, that's very nice. Very, very nice.
But to go to the third part of your question of how we started working on this together, actually, years ago, this started as a documentary on evolutionary themes in movies, because I went to film school, and
cool.
I was about the pyramid of human needs that we'll go over, I think, in a few minutes. And I was like, this really explains how characters in movies have to make choices. And then as we were working on that, people started saying, well, it also explains how everybody can make these sort of choices. So that's how this collaboration began.
No, that's wonderful. Well, the book is Solving Modern Problems with a Stone Age Brain, Human Evolution and the 7 Fundamental Motives. That's a great title. How long did it take you guys to kind of write this? I mean, there's a lot of stuff put into it. I mean, I'm sure if you guys have written a textbook and you guys have taught this stuff, and I'm sure you pulled from a lot of sources. But how long did it actually take you to write it and get it all done?
I think if you count the time we started talking about writing a book on film and actually started drafting that up, that's at least 3 years, I would say.
I think it's I think we were working on that a decade ago, to be honest.
The idea a decade ago.
The idea. We've sort of been bouncing the idea around a decade ago. And then I think we actually were pitching the book idea about 3 years ago, got a contract, and then it took about a year of actual writing, I think. And so,
yeah.
But a lot of it came from, we live near each other. And so we take bike rides. Dave has a couple of teenage kids who are just reaching their teens. But when they were little kids, he also has a younger brother who just reached college age, but he was a young teenager when we started out. And so we would bike around and ask questions of, so all this research, evolutionary psychology sort of started out as a kind of a theoretical discipline. It was interested in just these questions of what do we share in common with other animal species? And it was more an intellectual exercise, I think. And over the years, though, as we've learned more and more about human nature and began to look at we began studying just mate selection and those sorts of things, and aggression, the sort of negative side of human nature. But then, of course, obviously human nature includes all this wonderful positive stuff. And so over the years, as the research has developed, we've begun to think about how can all this stuff be applied? And some of what the book talks about is that in many ways we have a set of motivational systems that our ancestors evolved to deal with certain kinds of problems. Let's get real concrete about that. We have a pyramid that resembles the way you see Maslow's pyramid of needs. And in fact, it borrows a lot from Maslow's ideas. But the idea is that over the course of development, our human ancestors needed to, solve certain problems in developmental sequence. First thing is get yourself fed. Okay, get mom to nurse you and to keep you warm, and then a little bit later, kids start to crawl around, and the next concern is stay away from dangerous strangers. Okay, so these needs persist throughout life. We still need to get fed; it doesn't go away, and we still need to stay warm. That doesn't go away. We still need to avoid dangerous other people who might hurt us. So these motivational systems come online developmentally, but they don't go away. Then after that, if you watch kids, you see that when they're very young in preschool, they don't care much about making friends. And all of a sudden, they want to have some friends. Then once you make friends, you start to worry about getting some respect from those friends. And all of these are actually things that Maslow had in his hierarchy, more or less. By some names, he was sort of an early evolutionary psychologist. But then after getting some respect, now you're hitting puberty and you start to become concerned with, let's find a mate, okay? And people aren't thinking, let's find a reproductive partner as a biological animal. They're just thinking, let me find somebody who's attracted to me, who I'm attracted to. Then once you solve that problem, which is not an easy one, you've got a different problem, hanging on to that mate. And then from a developmental perspective, the final phase from an evolutionary perspective on human beings, not the humanistic perspective that sort of drove some of Maslow's other thinking, but at the top is taking care of your kin. And so we're a species that has always had to do those. Not all animals do all those things. Some animals don't take care of their offspring. Okay, some animals don't. Most mammals don't maintain bonds with their romantic partners, but human beings do, and they do it in every society that's ever been looked at. And so there's always been this set of problems. Now, here we are in the modern world. What the book addresses, why it's called Solving Modern Problems with a Stone Age Brain, is we've got all these systems that were designed to solve the problem under a certain set of circumstances. So however long humans have been around, I see various estimates. It's not all that long. It might only be, 100,000 years. I don't know the exact time that people are now saying in anthropology, but we're a relatively new species, but still for at least 60,000 years, we were living under certain circumstances, and it's only in the last few thousand years that things radically started to change. We started to live around non-relatives. We started to congregate into agricultural communities, and then we got cities. Okay, and now in the modern world, we have all this wonderful technology. We have these devices which should be able to solve every one of those problems, okay? I have notes from Dave's younger brother. I can connect with my family members. I can order food. I can signal somebody. I can call the police if there's somebody after me. I can get a lot of likes on Facebook and increase my social reputation, okay, and my friendship factor. So you think I'd be really delighted, all this wonderful technology, and yet people are miserable. Okay. Why? Okay. Why aren't we just delighted, thinking all these problems are solved? So that's the kind of basic frame of the book.
Before I jump in here and ask my follow-up to that, I think you want to add here, Dave?
No, I think that does capture it pretty well. So
yeah, I guess you answered the question about how is it different from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow was a humanist psychologist, but in many ways, yes, there was some evolutionary components to it. But you talked about how reproduction is center, right? That's kind of one of the centerpieces. And so the items on the pyramid list are survival, protecting yourself, making and keeping friends, getting respect, finding a mate, keeping the mate. I find that hilarious that those are two different things. And caring for one's family. So, you can either one of you can kind of go through some of these or all of them, but how is the kind of centering of it? For Maslow, it was self-actualization, which I believe he felt that no one really got in life, or very few people did. It sounds here there's this aspect of that's not really the emphasis, but more of there's a reproductive center there. So kind of just chat about that, and then maybe the specifics.
Well, I think one thing when it comes to our pyramid versus Maslow's, really, the pyramid was developed by my dad, Steve Newberg, Mark Schaller, and Vladimir Skavostic. But our pyramid versus Maslow's is, I don't think ours necessarily emphasizes the top needs are better in any way, right? It's more of a developmental pyramid in the sense that, so it starts with needs like finding resources and self-protection that you're going to have to be worried about from a very young age. But then friendship, that tends to develop sort of around the time kids are maybe going to preschool, maybe going to kindergarten, right? Starting to think about these interactions become very important to kids sort of school age. And then, puberty. Well, actually there's status in there, which actually does sort of start to come in around sort of later middle school, I think. But then puberty obviously brings about the interest in mate acquisition and mate selection, as well as, and then acquiring a mate sort of has to happen before retaining a mate, and then taking care of offspring obviously also has to come after acquiring a mate. And so, but I think a key thing, which even came back down to the way we sort of designed and drew out this pyramid, is it's like, you can almost think of it like a prism where those other needs continue to shine through. And it's not exactly like you should be thinking, I need to get to the top, or I need to build one level and then forget it and move on to the next level.
So it's not prepotent upon it, right? So it's not like you need this and then this, or it's not in necessarily a linear fashion. Like you can have, there's a developmental aspect to it, but one doesn't stop or cease. Like there's a continuous piece of it.
Once you develop, right? It isn't like one supersedes the others.
And you know what I think makes life so well, I think even these things, like these sort of bottom things like self-protection and getting food, they seem to usually take priority, right? It's hard to do a lot of the other things without that. But there are times where we may decide to, risk our own lives for the protection of our kin or even our friends or our potential mates. And so there will throughout life always be these sort of trade-offs where you'll be choosing how to balance these 7 motives, essentially.
Well, one of the things that Doug was getting at a little bit was, which I want to kind of push on, is, so you mentioned how these are kind of, embedded in what it means to be human. But as you mentioned earlier, Doug, I mean, if you go back to, Homo erectus, right, and then you go to, various humans that were on the planet at the same time, we went go millions of years ago or thousands of years ago. Obviously, the world has changed, right? And it's changed rapidly. So for a long time, it was hunter-gatherers, et cetera, Neolithic period. But even, you can look at things of how, once we got to more of an agrarian society and then an industrial age and now a digital age, things are much more rapidly changing. But we have these, this kind of, these presets, if you will. So I guess the question I have is for this way in which you guys are describing it with this pyramid of these various things, how was it, how might this have looked for our ancestors? And then how does it look for us now in a modern world? What are some of the similarities and the differences?
So I don't think the motivational things have changed. We still want the same things that our ancestors wanted. Okay. I don't know about earlier versions of Homo, how they're socialized, but Homo sapiens, we can talk, Homo sapiens been around long enough to have evolved a particular structure. And then all these other changes have been pretty rapid. All right. So we certainly know that we haven't been able to evolve new mental mechanisms to deal with iPhones, for example, because they've only been around for one generation. And we probably haven't even adjusted to life in complicated big cities all that much, because even when we came into the cities, we brought a lot of the features of human groups. So I told you I grew up in New York City, but on my block, I had my grandmother living next door, my aunt living in another apartment in another building. I had cousins living nearby. And I was I lived in a little urban village, and that was New York City, okay, in the 19 and so it's only really recently that people began to just move way far away from their kin. Nobody took airplane rides when I was a kid, but now it's nothing to get on a plane and, fly, to somewhere else to go to school, or to take a job. And so I don't think we've evolved our minds or whatever, our motivational mechanisms haven't had time to catch up with all this. And in fact, it's changing so quickly, it's almost, how could they catch up? We still want those. I still want, at the bottom of the pyramid, I still want a lot of calories, even though in the modern world, our ancestors this is the mismatch problem. So in the chapter on this, we talk about Walter Hudson, a guy from Long Island, or Brooklyn, actually, but he grew he grew to over 1,000 pounds because he just laid in bed and his sister brought him food. And he got to the point where he couldn't even get out of the bedroom. Now, that couldn't have happened for our ancestors because their problem was not okay. Our problem, this is the mismatch. We've got, the United Nations estimates that now more people die of problems related to obesity than die of starvation in the world. This is counting all those places where your mother tells you, oh, they're starving somewhere. They're no longer starving in China. And they are starving in some places, but more people are dying of diabetes and heart-related diseases than ever before. And so we have a new issue in the modern world that doesn't really match. And if we go up the pyramid, protecting ourselves from the bad guys, our ancestors there was a lot of homicide. Okay, I don't know if you ever talked to Steven Pinker on your, but Pinker,
I haven't, but I've read his work though, for sure.
Okay, and so he has this, he does a very nice review of all the data on what do we know about violence rates amongst, hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists, traditional societies and throughout history, and let's compare it with the modern world. Mm-hmm. And, when you look at those statistics, it's very scary to think about the homicide rate in New Orleans, which is one of the most it's usually the most violent city in our country, which is the most violent developed country. Nevertheless, the homicide rates among peaceful hunter-gatherers, the peaceful ones, not the violent ones, were about the same as in New Orleans today. Okay, so we live in we're less likely to be killed by strangers coming over the hill and burning down the village, because now we have police forces and we have rules and so forth. And most people obey them, not all of them. Okay. But our biggest danger today isn't really from bad guys coming over the hill. We are still afraid of them and we still should be. Okay. But most of the dangers come from sort of technological sort of, mosquitoes, that are parasitizing us in little teeny ways, taking a little fee for this, a little fee for that, and when you add up all of those fees, they amount to, thousands of dollars a year, but they fly under our radar. They're like mosquitoes. We get annoyed at them once in a while, but they're not enough to get us up in arms. And so it's another case in which our mechanisms are designed for one kind of a threat. And now there's some new threats, and we're not quite ready for them.
So,
go ahead, Dave.
Now, I imagine in terms of how our Stone Age brains are reacting to this, right? Is there are certain pressures on a lot of these things, right? You commit crimes, you're going to go to jail. If you eat too much high-calorie foods, you're going to be more likely to have a heart attack. And so most likely over the next 100 generations or so, some of these things will be weeded out. But there's also the question of, so for example, I really like high-calorie foods, and I would prefer not to be weeded out through selection pressures. So, so there's this question of, well, what can I do to not quietly into the night from a genetic perspective? So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, I'm with you. I also like high calorie foods, and as I get older, I feel like I have no metabolism anymore. I remember I had a conversation with Dan Lieberman, who wrote this wonderful book called Exercised, and he really kind of dispelled some of the sort of the myths about how there's this kind of overemphasis on exercise. We obviously should exercise, but more so of how are we active, right? So that doesn't just mean that you're lifting weights in the gym, although that's not a bad thing, but how are you, kind of active as a way of life? And so sedentary life he talks about that in the book. And, obviously it's not a horrible thing, but, you should have also some activity. And so it kind of reminds me of, when he's looked at other groups around the world, and I think he does some of the history there, where it's, our ancestors would just, you'd walk from place to place, you'd carry things, and that was your kind of way of being active. So, kind of what to both your points is, it sounds like the world changed faster than we can catch up to it, almost. And so we have all of these these things that come in the box, and so the world is changing, and so we have to find different ways, and so there is going to be that kind of that mismatch. I guess in terms of, again, kind of knowing that, right? There's some basics, right? We need to procreate, we need to eat, we need to drink water, there's basic things to survive. How do we understand between, and this is probably going to be somewhat case specific sometimes, or regionally specific, but how do we understand more of what is it we need and what is something that becomes in excess for some of these fundamental traits? I think that becomes kind of a problem that sometimes people will have is, well, how much food should we have? There's like the 2,000 caloric intake, but some people say, well, no, that's not true, and you get mixed messaging on that. Some people will say that you can have too much sex or you don't have enough, right? There's some certain things going on now with that. People aren't having as much sex. People are waiting later to get married. So on and so forth. So how do we understand, kind of in our modern world, how do we find a kind of balance? And I'm not thinking there's a universal kind of baseline, but how do we recalibrate our intuitions on that? Let me ask you that way.
So I think, I personally do not have like a perfect system where my watch can tell me exactly when to stop eating or when to flirt with somebody versus not flirt with somebody, right? But I do think that there are ways in which our brains are still not totally miscalibrated, right? And often we have a general sense of what is going to be a good decision versus a bad decision, but those sometimes immediate pleasures, across all of these categories can weigh really loudly, right? You can if you see, I think like in like why Buddhism is true, Robert Wright talks about, like, if you shouldn't eat a donut and you're looking at a donut, you're still going to want that donut, right? Like that, like salient sort of immediate pleasure is there. And I think that, so I think one of the things we sort of discuss in the book is just being conscious of what are these 7 things tend to matter to people in some ways, right? Now, not everybody is going to have a partner. Not everybody is going to want to have kids, right? And nor do we actually think, this is part of why I stress this idea of you don't necessarily need to get to the top. I'm not sure that everybody needs to be having kids or like doing anything like this, but thinking about these, how will any given decision affect all of these motives is a decent framework for sort of assessing on an individual level what's important to you, and will one particular decision or another decision help or hurt that? And then if you decide it hurts that, such as eating the donut, then there's things like, controlling your environment to try to keep those things away, stimulus control. So I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Yeah, no, I think it kind of goes into the next point, which is, you guys spend some time in the book talking about kind of like your basics of behaviorism, right? You talk about reinforcement, punishment, shaping, stimulus control, all these things we learned in, either undergrad or grad school at some point. A lot of these things aren't just taught in psychology studies or of any sort. So they're taught in other disciplines as well. I think they do it in economics a little bit. They do it in other places. So how do they, I guess, kind of those basic principles of, behaviorism, right? Especially things like stimulus control and shaping, help us manage our environments, how we control our environments and how we can avoid, accidents and risk, and how can we use some of the principles of behaviorism for ourselves?
So I think what you bring up is a very good question, just because we did all hear about these things in undergraduate introductory psychology, but we don't necessarily apply them. And it does require, so one of the interesting problems is that we've got automatic impulses, okay? And then we also do have a cortex that can think about the long-term implications. And we can make decisions and say, okay, like you asked before, how do I know how to set how much food I want to take in? Well, we do have other mechanisms for deciding that. I can look down and see, I've got this pot belly and it's neither attractive and I know it not to be healthy. And so what can I do? And so I can consciously decide, well, I'd like to control that. But what's interesting is people really do need to have a program. They need to they really need to get those principles behavior modification, which don't come from an evolutionary perspective. They come from a behavioral perspective, but extremely useful in terms of knowing how can I change? And the first principle is stimulus control. You can, and it's, you may say this, and we may all understand this. Dave and I certainly understand it. I'll bet you understand, but I don't know if you're as bad as we are. I still bring a bunch of chocolate into the house, and I put 6 packs of IPA in the refrigerator. But when I don't, when I'm doing the right thing, because I occasionally do get in shape, and the way I do it is I basically tell myself, take the chocolate, get it out of view, or don't even bring it home from the store. And don't bring home my favorite IPA from the supermarket, and just set a rule for myself, and then don't tempt to. It's very hard. It's much easier to control your environment than to resist temptation. So when you actually do act on that, when you actually do control your environment, and Dave mentions another thing, which is make it so you have to walk or bike to work. Okay, he suggests, even if you can't bike all the way to work or walk all the way to work, at least park far away and set yourself up so you're forced to do some exercise on the deal. And he and I both gave up our parking stickers and we bike into work. It's nice, and it turns out that once we made that decision to give up the parking sticker, we have to bike. Okay. And so we've changed the environment. Go ahead, Dave. Sorry. So
I just want to say, just to give a broad overview of, stimulus control and like setting up your environment. What it boils down to is you're going to generally want to make undesirable behaviors difficult, and you're going to want to make healthier alternatives easier. And also you're going to want to make healthier choices. And healthier, we've been talking about food, but I think one of the things is you can apply these to all 7 motives, but desirable choices, you reward. So you make them rewarding. And then also you remove reminders of undesirable behaviors, and you give yourself reminders of desirable behaviors. And so all these examples are sort of working into those sorts of frameworks of it basically just boils down to make the things you don't want to do as tough as possible, make the things you do want to do as easy as possible. So for me, biking into work, now when it's Arizona and it's 180, it is not, it's miserable. It's absolutely miserable. But, in terms of time, I'm always like, it takes me like 15 minutes to bike to work. It takes me almost 15 minutes to drive to work, which I got to admit, I'm lucky for a person in a city. I know a lot of people who have to drive an hour or more. But, these sorts of things of like thinking through, for me, I'm like, well, that saves me. I get exercise and it saves me the commute in what's pretty bad traffic, around ASU. And so I think just when people think about these things, say they want to make friends, coming up with easy ways to see your friends in person will make you be more likely to see your friends in person. So yeah, basically just make the desirable things easy, make the unwanted things tough.
So one thing that I think David's got, which I like that David's pointed out to me, that stimulus control is often applied to things like eating and exercise. Okay, that's a familiar zone. But what's something throughout this book, all these other motives, you can do the same sort of thing. So for example, overperception of threats, this idea that, oh my God, we're going to get killed, if you're a Democrat, you think that the Republicans are going to overthrow the government and make guns mandatory in kindergarten and take away grandma's Social Security check. If you're a Republican, you think the Democrats are going to let everybody in the world in through our borders and, require drugs of children or something, and it's because read this media feeds our fears. And that's partially the media isn't so much to blame because they're just giving us what we want. Okay. We're used to looking for, our ancestors had to find the threats. And so now we're tuned to threats. But one of the things you can do is what I have done is I took the New York Times and Washington Post apps off my phone because I don't want to be reminded all day long about what the crazies are going to do to me. Okay. I want to be left alone. And so I make it a little bit harder for me to get that crazy news, and similar kinds of things. If I want to avoid infidelity, okay, if I'm married and I want to stay married, it's not a big problem for a 74-year-old man, okay? There's not a lot of temptations running around, but for you younger guys, there are, things like, don't even put the Ashley Madison app if it still exists on your phone, okay? Basically, make it hard. Don't make it easy to do the things that you consciously know I don't want to do. Because in the long run, we are good at understanding what's good. We're really bad at resisting temptation in the moment. And so the more you can structure your environment to basically do the things that you consciously, our ancestral minds are designed to take it if it's there in front of us now, because there weren't that many opportunities the way there are now. But the modern world, we can consciously say, okay, I know the long-term dangers of this, and I'm going to basically control my environment in all of these different ways.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it can translate to different things with relationships or with certain preferences we may have that may not always be good for us. For myself, if I go to the grocery store, sometimes I don't go down certain aisles, so that way I don't buy the potato chips. Or if it's, if I'm sometimes if I'm coming home and from, if I'm out somewhere and, I don't really eat fast food, but, if it's late and I'm hungry, well, I won't go the way that, I have to drive right by the McDonald's because I don't really eat that food. But if I'm hungry and it's late, well, I'm not going to go home. I'm not going to make something. Well, it's whatever. It's fast and quick. And then I feel terrible afterwards. But yeah, so I definitely think so. I also think that, something I can't remember if you guys mentioned in the book, but, I'm a really big believer. I'm not a behaviorist, but I'm a big believer, though, in differential reinforcement, right? So where there's this idea that, okay, well, I'm not going to reinforce the negative behavior, but I'm also, while I'm not reinforcing a negative behavior, I am going to reinforce something I do want to do, right? Yeah. So that there's this kind of parallel of sorts of, oh, okay, you know what? This is where, I think working out or of any sort, right? If you, take very, very long walks or you do bike rides or you go to the gym or whatever, if I run, 3 miles, well, then it's like, well, I just ran 3 miles, so I don't want to eat, 3 cups of ice cream. Then it's just all in the trash, and I work so hard, and I just, so I'm like, you know what? I'm not even, so I, don't really have ice cream in the house. Okay, well, I'm not gonna, go buy the Baskin Robbins or whatever it is because, I'm trying to reward something else, instead of the thing that can be harmful. Of course, I think we all agree, for anyone listening, things are fine in moderation. It's fine to have an IPA, but it's one of those things that if it is something that is hard or is something that is tough for us to, manage, I think making it difficult to have that is.
What I do, Xavier, speaking of an IPA, it's hot in Arizona, so I'll keep my 6-pack in a closet in the back where it's heated, and I'll just take one out in the refrigerator an hour before I want it because I don't really like hot beer. And so this way I drink my one beer and I think I'd love to have a second one, but I don't want to have a hot one. And so, in some sense, I used my basically conscious, programming of my cerebral cortex to plan in advance and make it so it's easy. It's easy to have the amount I want,
I've done the same thing, or sometimes I'll buy singles. Or sometimes what I'll do is, I'll only get it sometimes if I know I'll have people over, right? So if I get a 6-pack, maybe I'll have 1 or 2 left, and then it's done. So then it's like, okay, I don't have, because it's one of those things. If it's laying around and it's there, it's like, well, I wasn't going to have this on a Tuesday night, but why not? And so it is one of those things where it's like, how do you set up these kind of blockades for yourself of sorts? I guess the you kind of mentioned it earlier about this idea of violence, and you mentioned Pinker's work, and it's the better nature of our angels, or better angels of our nature, whatever it is. Right. But what about some of the negative aspects of our nature? So you're talking about a lot of the cooperative or positive ones, but what about the negative pieces of wanting to harm others, usually with the threat of retaliation? Where does that sit within our cooperative nature, right? How do we understand that there are dark sides of cooperation? You can get together to do horrible things to other people, and we have many examples of that in our history. How do we kind of understand that we have these kind of conflicting aspects of our human nature, and how do we try to offset them?
You have a thought on that, Dave?
Well, I was just going to say that is that's a tough challenge. I think that, like we were saying earlier, it is, in terms of physical violence, the modern world is safer than it has been, but that doesn't mean it's perfectly safe. It also doesn't mean that, if somebody cuts you off in traffic, you don't momentarily think about off the road or whatever, right? Like, we still have these sort of aggressive impulses. My dad even has studies showing how many people have had homicidal fantasies. And I think that still exists with us. And I think the way that in the modern world is really getting turned against us is we have these, I don't know if it's turned against us by any particular person, or just we now have reached this point where we've gone from these sort of small tribes to these giant tribes, right? And we will sort of like have these very odd affiliations with people from all the way across the country, right? So you may feel more connected to somebody who votes the same way you do than someone who lives across the street from you, right? And so these sorts of things are, they can lead to things like, they can lead to pretty extreme arguments, like the dissolving of friendships and families and these sorts of things. And so
it's actually, Dave, just on that note, Adi Wiesel, who's a graduate student of mine, is interested in political social psychology. She told me that that prejudice towards the other political side is much stronger now than racially based prejudice in the United States. That most people, in fact, feel guilty about and don't on the side that be racially prejudiced, okay? But they feel completely comfortable and open about hating the red versus blue, the other side of that divide. And that's an interesting one, because in some sense, it's exploiting our ancestral tribal mechanisms to put us into this new, warring group with the other side.
And I mean, the nice thing is that we generally don't have as much sort of day-to-day violence, but these sorts of tribal lines, as you can see sort of in the Ukraine, like these sorts of, they can lead to serious, when we have wars these days, we have big wars. And so that is it's a tough challenge, right? This challenge of,
so we do talk a little bit in the book about some research that I think can be used to at least slow down that process. There's this research on dehumanization that basically shows that if you ask Israelis, how many Palestinians is it okay to kill to save one Israeli soldier, and the number is in the hundreds. It's okay to kill several hundred Palestinians to save one Israeli soldier. And when you ask Palestinians, they say the converse of that, okay? That it's okay to kill lots of Israelis to save one Palestinian. And the guy who does this research, I'm forgetting his name, he's at Northwestern University. His name may come to me in a minute, but it's very fascinating research. Even shows these pictures of, the sort of the T-shirts with the Darwinian, it'll start over here with a kind of a baboon, and then there'll be a semi-upright gorilla, then there'll be Australopithecus, and then there's an upright human being, and then on the left, there's somebody with coffee or with, Boston Red Sox on, he actually shows a variant of that going from, kind of or ancestral primates that are not remotely human through, primates through. And he asks people he asks Israelis and Palestinians to put the other group on these, and they rate each other as substantially lower on this evolutionary hierarchy. So we have a natural tendency to think of people who are our enemies as non-human. But there's actually some interesting research that suggests that if you just give people a little bit of evidence that some of those people on the other side have the same emotional reaction to something like a child being hurt that you do, it really it can work to to overcome some of that. And I think I actually find it helpful, to think in these terms, that when I'm disliking somebody else, I actually just read a lovely book, and by Barbara Kingsolver, and it's called what is it called? Flight Behavior. And in the book, she's talking about the flight of the monarch butterflies, but they're in this area of Virginia, where she lives in Virginia, but this is taking place in Tennessee, and she's describing these born-again, white, fundamentalist, uneducated people who normally educated people look down their nose on. And just hearing, because she lives in the South, and hearing her descriptions of these people and, getting inside of their lives and realizing how hard it is to be poor and to have to, to not have the kind of resources that educated people have. Just hearing about that, just reading that book for me opened my eyes. And I think I'm not going to be so quick to be judging people on the other side from me after just hearing about that. These are real people. They've got children. They love their children. They want a better life for their children. And the more we can see that, in some sense, I almost think the media, they always say, well, bad news sells, but I almost feel like the media should be incentivized to just have to have some good news every day, to talk about, to give, instead of telling me the nasty things that the other people are about to do to me, why don't you tell me something nice, about these folks? And in some sense, it was the hope when Biden became president, because he's got that nice guy thing going, you know what I mean? He talks to people on both sides, and he gives his phone number to the conductor on the train who's, lost a kid, or I forget the story, but, but that hasn't happened so much, I'm sad to say, that we haven't actually, Biden doesn't talk much, and we're still hearing a lot of this negative talk in the media. But wouldn't it be nice if we really just got an inside look at how people on the other side love their kids, and how people on the other side, are concerned with what's the problems financially that they're confronting,
So I think there's a really easy, it's not really easy, but there's a practical way, and it sort of goes back to the robbers cave experiment, right? Where the rattlers and the eagles, when they worked together, this was where they took the kids and they put them into two randomly selected groups, and they called them rattlers and eagles. They ended up hating each other, but then when they would have to work together, they worked it out. That is a thing that I think still in real life is, I started going around, and I started volunteering a few years back with this theater company with people who, it's an inclusive theater company. So like we coach people who have different, special needs and things like that. And that has a wide range of political people from political viewpoints, but they all come together to do a thing that's pretty non-controversial, right? Everybody is on board, which is sort of the case with things in life, right? Like that most, regardless of political perspective, most people are going to want to help people in need. Most people are going to be against cancer and against starvation and things like this. And probably also generally going to be in favor of helping animals or puppies or whatever, right? So if you pick a thing like that you like and actually go out in person, which I know was hard the past few years with COVID, but so, it really does wonders of you. It's much harder to think about, those guys are all jerks when 20 of them and you see them show up every day and work with you to try to solve a problem. So I think that's a pretty good solution.
Yeah, I would firmly agree. There's a few points there I want to touch on. On the last point you were just mentioning, Dave, is I've known a variety of people. I can think of a few people I know personally that have kind of been in, they've lived in DC or New York or whatever, and they're around a lot of liberals or progressives or things like that, and they kind of get in a sort of an echo chamber or a little bit of a bubble, and say like very for whatever cause is going on at the moment. And I think many folks are well intentioned with that stuff. I don't think it's not always about signaling, although it does have signaling aspects to it, of course, just like anything else does. But then when those people, when they for whatever reason they move away for work or school or whatever, and they move to other places, whether internationally, I'm thinking at the moment of just other places in the United States. So they move to the Midwest, or kind of the central part of the United States, or sometimes the South. They're and they're there 6 months to a year even, right? And they're in the same they're in the same body, obviously, but they're, things look a little different, right? If when you go to the gas station and you go to the store, and everyone kind of has the same 4 restaurants they go to, and whatever, and even if you have go into town, or if you go into a place, or it doesn't have to even be a small town, it could still be kind of a city, but it's just not as it has more diversity, if you will, of thinking, right? Politically and culturally, and all different types of things. Your place, you're kind of forcing yourself, of sorts, to see the humanity in different types of people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I live in a place that is, I live in Western Maryland, and kind of the main city close to where I live has over the past 10 years become fairly balanced. There was a couple of years ago, I don't know if it was during the 2020 election or somewhere around there, the New York Times put this kind of interactive tool where you could put in your zip code and you could see politically how, I think it does just like registration, people that are registered, Democrats or Republicans or independents. And, I put where I used to live. I live closer to DC, and it was like 85%, liberal Democrat or whatever, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I put where I live now, and it was basically 50-50, right? And there's a difference in how you have to sit kind of with different ideas. We have folks that live where I live, especially closer to a city that, it's not a huge city by any means, but they're definitely kind of the standard kind of liberal progressive ideals and things like that, for diversity, equality, and those are all great things. And then you have folks that are maybe less, boisterous about that, or they have different ideas, or they have, a little bit more traditional mindsets, and having folks interact together doing different things, I think is good, because people are able to be respectful and cohabitate There are certain places around the United States specifically that have that. There's a good mixture of different things. People that have been there for generations, people that just moved there 5 years ago, people that have different political persuasions, people that have different cultures and ethnicities. And so I think I totally agree, on the dehumanizing point, I think, for all the wonderful things social media has, I think one of the problems that happens on, I think a lot of it happens on Twitter, maybe on Facebook, and other platforms is, there's a way to be dissociated from the real person. You don't have to care about somebody's feelings, right? If I get online and somebody says something I disagree with or whatever, I can just say that, they're an asshole and a piece of shit. And I can just log off and I'm done, right? But there's a person, barring, aside there's many bots and things like that, but
sure,
there's a person that's behind that, and I wouldn't say that. I mean, maybe other people would, but I wouldn't say that to someone in real life. I'm not going to go to a bar or go to a restaurant and say, well, you disagree and, you're an asshole because you think of X, Y, and Z. But so there's that kind of, we forget the human and we just see the kind of, words on the screen or an avatar or some profile or something like that. And we're able to kind of, I think, dissociate. And, I think scaling that at such a large level becomes problematic because, then if you're getting, you make a post and you get, 45 comments, well, you can't see the individuals and all that. You're just seeing comments, right? And then the ones you don't like, you're just going back at it, with all of the emotion or whatever behind it. And so I definitely think that the dehumanization piece is problematic, and it's really hard to incentivize humanizing certain things, whether it's digitally or socially, and where some of that kind of breaks down even in real life. So those are kind of my fresh thoughts on some of what you guys were saying.
So this is interesting. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that there's some, the research on cooperation and competition came to mind when you were talking about this, Facebook thing, because I had somebody who was an aggressive person get onto my Facebook account and start arguing with my son, about he was a kind of a conspiracy theorist and a little bit kooky, but a smart guy in other ways, has a PhD in social psychology.
I also want to say in this guy's defense, I'm also kind of a conspiracy theorist and a little bit kooky. So it was sort of a back and forth.
Yeah. So. Okay. Different conspiracies.
Right. We just disagreed on this one particular topic.
Right. Yeah. His seemed like a conspiracy to me because I didn't agree with it. But my initial reaction was that, he was kind of attacking some of and he was doing this thing which, males sometimes do. They go out and they start trouble on Facebook. There's a guy in Denmark, I think, I'm forgetting his name now. It'll come to me later. But he does research looking at this sort of chaos-seeking behavior. Mm-hmm. People go out and, just kind of want to, make chaos. And you do get that. But my response to this guy initially was to just say, he'd been attacking me for, I had just said that after some bill was passed that I disagreed with, okay? And I'll admit, I have a liberal bias, and it was, and so somebody had, just passed maybe an anti-abortion thing, and I just said, I'm going to contribute, X number of dollars to everybody on the other side of this. And this, colleague of mine accuses virtue signaling and starts attacking me personally, and then talking a little bit personally about how he hadn't gotten a job at my university and that. And I said, hey, I wanted to hire you and I respect your work. And I just, instead of responding with a fight, I said two nice things to him and it defused it. And there's this interesting, the research on cooperation and competition indicates that it's really easy to get stuck in a competitive loop. And sometimes if you just, play the tit for tat game is I'll only attack you if you attack me, but then I'll back off, But, often just saying something nice can actually have an amazing effect on, telling somebody that you like them, for example, can really shut them up when they're in attack dog mode.
I want to point out that does not work on Reddit. I have tried.
No,
really?
it's
Okay.
a little bit hard on Reddit.
Like, oh, so you're admitting I'm right. So,
right. Well, so my son doesn't listen to my advice because I told him, stay off Reddit.
Well, so let me just say, going back to this idea of these sort of modern problems, right? And the way different things are incentivized and the way these incentives interact with our sort of Stone Age brains is I love an internet argument. I find it like it gets me sort of angry, but it will monopolize my attention like almost nothing else, right? Like I will spend all day just thinking about what I'm going to say to this person. And as much as I think, this person is so wrong, I will then check. I'll when I see the little notification bell of like, aha, they responded. It's great. And I don't know why, like, other than maybe it's because you're having this sort of intense conversation with somebody, like.
Well, it's an engagement. You're wrestling with ideas.
We like to argue, in a dialectic way.
Right.
But doesn't it feel better when it's polite, though, Dave? When it's like, if you look at our lab, Newberg and I argue all the time, but we respect each other, okay?
So going back to sort of incentivizes, right? Because Reddit, you get upvotes, you get downvotes, you can sort of see who's winning, who's losing, right? I've tried, well, there's two things I've tried. One is I've tried using my real name on Reddit, which like is interesting. But then also I will take conversations. If a conversation gets heated, I will like apologize to the person through a direct message and sort of, I've had a couple of times, a lot of times people don't respond, but I've had quite a few times where then once you talk to the person outside the sort of gladiatorial arena, it's actually much easier to say, okay, I do see where you're coming from, and this is where I'm coming from, and even if you don't agree to sort of reach this point of, oh, I get it. I could see how if I was in your position, I might feel the same way, right? And so I think one of the really interesting things now at this stage of technological advancement is just figuring out how do we incentivize the type of interactions, almost going back to this idea we were saying before of rewarding what we want and making the things we don't want harder. How can we do this through technology? I think is a really fun question.
Yeah, I think that is the important question, because I have seen over the past 3 years, 2 to 3 years, at a large scale and at an independent scale, that we are incentivizing the wrong things. We're incentivizing outrage, reaction, and over the past couple of years, we're incentivizing people to kind of, get on a hobby horse. They make a podcast or a Substack or something, and then they get a following, and then people just literally financially incentivize them to just keep the same echo chamber going. Right. And you pick your issue, right? It doesn't, you'll find the 3 issues or whatever that people get really exercised about. And then it's just like this like negative feedback loop where people are just reading the same things over and over and over and over about this one issue. And then it's like, look, there's some value to some of these issues, right? If you want to talk about gender or race or certain political things or whatever, that's fine. But what's happening is that people are curating now the things of certain people that are, making content of whatever sort. They're writing, they're making videos, they're whatever they're doing. And then that's all people are doing. Or the 6 or 7 people that are in that same thing. And that's becoming problematic because it's incentivizing, literally financially, people to just keep writing about the same nonsense, right? At a larger scale, this happens. I think the biggest example of this is, or one of the biggest examples was, I understand some of it, but like the absolute free advertisement that, CNN gave Trump in 2015 and 2016. It was something in like the billions of dollars of amount of free campaigning. Yeah, and it still happens. And look, I get it. Like, I get it. I do get it. You can't not talk about some of that stuff. I get that. But it's just the way it was. I mean, it was nonstop, and it was, when he would brag about ratings and things like that. I mean, there was some truth to that. That was what people were just, it was like it's like the car accident when you're on the other side of the road and you stop and you can't avoid looking. It's like, oh, it's awful, but like, oh, I got to look at it. Like that's what it felt for, 4 or 5 years. And it was just one of those things where how do we disincentivize that and incentivize other things? And I think that that's really difficult because people that try to find the more positive or really nice stories or nice aspects in society, they tend to be really, really cringe. They tend to be really over the top. They tend to be super and it doesn't feel sometimes authentic, or it will feel kind of like there's a show put on. And so it's hard to really find some of that stuff or you're not getting viewership and clicks and things like that. So your question is a good one that I think is something we have to wrestle with. And the last thing I'll say on this is I've talked about these topics with other people of sorts in a roundabout way. And what I've said is look, at the end of the day, it comes down to us, right? Mm-hmm. I don't watch those things, right? Not because, I'm trying to put my head in the sand, right? I don't want to give that all my attention all the time. So I selectively look for things that have a wide range of positions and viewpoints and things like that. And that's my choice. And I think people take a lot of the times the easy way out. Who's my circle? Who's my echo chamber? Who's the person I like? Who's the person I agree with? And then that's all they do. And to try and ask someone to say, yeah, don't do that. Go look for the person you disagree with and maybe see that they have some good points. Don't just shit on them. Like it's like Mission Impossible for a lot of people. It's just like, no, I'm going to watch Tucker Carlson and yes, it's own the libs and they're awful and all these things. And look, you saw that those 2 examples they found and now they're applying it to all of liberals. Yes, that's what I'm going to choose to believe and ignore all of the other examples and vice versa, right? This goes the other way, right? All these idiots and flyover states. Oh my God, they're so terrible. And it's like, no, what about all these other examples? Nope, don't want to look at that. That's hard, I think, for a lot of people to resist that urge to kind of just keep feeding the beast of sorts. And I think that's very hard. I wonder
if there's a way that, Dave has talked about this, and I think this idea, is there a way we could program our technology to force us to be good in the same way that I don't bring home all that chocolate from the supermarket and that I don't, put 6 IPAs in the fridge? Is there a way that we can program our, so what I do is I basically, I try to self-consciously not press on news about Trump because the thing you just said, all these years, I don't need to hear the same thing. So what if he did something else outrageous today? That's what he does to get attention. I don't want to feed it, but it's very hard not to do. But wouldn't it be nice if we could come up with programs that let us say in advance, okay, that I want to hear more good news, okay, and I think we actually might be able to do it, and there might even be ways. I wonder why the government. So here's Dave's favorite example lately is Mr. Rogers. Did we talk about this yet today?
No, we haven't talked about it.
So Mr. Rogers, I used to watch him as a kid, and I was a punky, pseudo tough guy from New York. And I thought, yeah, the guy's a phony, and I just read about it because Dave said, hey, we should talk about Mr. Rogers meets evolutionary psych. And I thought, oh, come on. And so I watched these 2 movies about Mr. Rogers. He was the real thing. Mm-hmm. He was really a nice guy. And he was actually an ordained Protestant minister who took as his mission bringing good news to television and having kids have an alternative to violent cartoons that were interrupted by materialistic advertisements, okay? And the kicker was he was very, very successful. Okay, really successful. And why I think, Dave can correct me on this, but it's like why Dave liked the connection with evolutionary psych is that he actually wasn't just a Pollyanna. He looked at reality the way it was. He actually looked at human nature. He said, look, we get angry. We cry. Look, we feel like shit a lot. He didn't say, because he was a nice guy, but we feel bad about ourselves. Bad things happen. There's assassinations. Okay. And he would talk about them, to little kids, and then keep stressing this thing of look at your feelings, but then make a choice. And in a sense, that's what an evolutionary perspective is. We want to see what human nature is really like. But it doesn't mean go out and just jump on every single impulse. Every time you get angry or lustful or whatever, it doesn't mean you want to go out and do that or hungry, but you want to understand where it's coming from. And then you make a choice, and I think that's a kind of a cool way to he's a good model because he was successful. He did, he promoted this neighborly thing. Now, he was only for little kids, but I sort of wonder whether the world isn't right for some kind of a hipper version of Mr. Rogers for adults now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dave, you wanted to jump in?
So partly I was going to say, so I feel like what you are doing, Xavier, is sort of like capturing a lot of what I think Mr. Rogers did well, which is that he would talk about these issues, but he would also have guests, right? And I think podcasts, especially podcasts with a wide range of guests, they're fascinating, and I think they give you a good sense of really where people are coming from as people. And so I think that this is a good example of sort of leveraging technology, for actual interaction. And so, yeah, that was basically, I think that sometimes
he's calling him Mr. in other words, Xavier.
Yeah. So
I watched him as a kid. I did. And I always had, really good vibes from him. And yes, I would agree. I would agree. I mean, my ultimate design, I guess you could say, was to create a space of, I've done it a few times. It's actually very hard to get people to agree to it. But to have literally people from the very opposite sides of an issue and to get them to talk about it. And I've done that a few times, and it's gone pretty well. But I've asked other people, and one person, one will say, "No, I don't want to do that. That sounds, you're great, but I just don't want to get into a whole thing," or they have a bad experience with it. That was the real. Not that I would do it every week that way, or excuse me, every episode, but it would be a lot more of that, and it is. It's hard to get people to agree to it. But that was the kind of idea to have that lane of it. And, and I think that's important. I mean, anytime I put, if I have a guest that's a little controversial, or if I have a topic that's a little controversial, I will agonize over it for weeks. And I'll listen to the episode a million times, trying to see okay, all the different points. But I'll just say that the genesis of that is, I went to a seminary, and when I went to a seminary, I'm not religious anymore, but I was for when I was younger, and it was the quintessential Reformed Calvinist seminary. We used to argue every single day about things in a text, and everyone was so convinced they were so right. And I was very young, and I would fall on different sides of things, and it was just these heated debates because it mattered. It was the most important thing to argue about, and I realized that was you can ruin friendships and relationships that way, and I certainly did. Not too many, but a few, and I realized it didn't. At the end of the day, you could win the argument but lose the person, right? And that was less important. And so I still have that kind of streak in me. I do, I think, a good job of managing those impulses, but I really try to find ways of really understanding other people and other points of view and experiences and perspectives. And so, that's one aim. But I agree with what you're saying, Doug, about we have to find other ways at scale of incentivizing some of the more good aspects of nature. The one topic we've sort of been talking around it, but is the idea of friendship. And so we've kind of sort of been mentioning relationships in general, but friendship is weird. It's pretty unique for humans. I just talked to Nick Christakis again. He's been on a few times now, and he was telling me about how friendship is pretty unique to humans. Not a lot of other species do it, and it has a pretty it can have a very adaptive element for us as humans. So I guess from your guys' sense and how you guys talk about it in the book, how do we understand friendships in the modern world, how that's evolved over time, and how does it keep going, especially in a digital age, which some of the aspects we've been discussing.
Well, I think friendships have traditionally had this sort of alliance cooperative benefit, right? You help me, I help you together. Actually, I was just watching a thing by Athena Actipus and Jessica Ayers, where they were just talking about, together we could take down a deer. Each of us alone could take down a bunny. Together we can take down a deer. You get a lot more meat, right? And so, and I think that still is the case in the modern world. That friendship, it really helps to be working together on things. I also do think that, and that's what we stress in our book, is the sort of working together. But throughout the course of this conversation, I've been thinking a lot about this sort of idea of sparring, right? And there is an element in the animal kingdom of sort of siblings will spar, right? They'll practice to get better at things. And I still think that's a very valuable aspect of friendship. Even thinking about sort of people in seminary, right, who are probably trying to get really good at figuring out how to convey their take, because they know that that's what the job depends on, right? Is getting up and preaching, right? And so, but then I think the key in the modern world is just making sure there's also ways to do the working together aspect. And I think that striking that balance is it's really valuable. When you work together with friends, even when you help, people always sort of complain about helping each other move. I kind of love it. It's kind of this thing where at the end of the day, you guys have all accomplished this task together, that would have been an absolute nightmare for one person to try to do on their own. But you get 5 or 6 friends together and you do it in a day. And so,
do you know what my rule is for that? I will help anybody move. I will lend my whatever strength I have. I just need pizza and beer at the end of the day. Those are my own. You don't have to pay me. You don't have to do anything for me. That's how you reward me, and I'm happy. I'll lift whatever couch you want, pizza and beer afterwards. That's always my
I'll do almost anything for pizza and beer.
Right. That's it. That's all I want at the end of the day.
Pizza is actually one of those things that we talked about earlier that I have to keep it out of my environment, or I'm in deep trouble.
Well, you're a good New Yorker then, I guess.
Especially compared with when it's paired with beer. There's because one slice of pizza is healthy. That fourth slice of pizza and that third beer,
anything. Go ahead.
Oh no, you go.
The friendship stuff. I actually want to say, Dave, I liked your idea, and I think you should talk with Jamie about it. You've talked with Jamie Krebs.
Yeah, Jamie Krebs. She's wonderful.
She's interested in all these aspects of friendship, but I don't know if there's any research on the thing you just described, which is that sparring thing that, maybe there is amongst, the assumption is that, well, little boys do it, but they think about it mostly as dominance striving. But I actually don't know that there's any research looking at the question of, in some sense, it's just practice. It's fun, so Dave gets together with his younger brother, who's only 18, and his son, who's, 6, right, Finian, whose middle name is Xavier, incidentally.
Very nice.
At any rate, And they often will kind of argue with one another, and we'll play these games where there's a little bit of competition, but it's kind of fun. And it is like it's practicing for competition in around your friends, around your supportive network. And I actually think we don't understand that well. Like Kahneman and diversity. We use the example of Daniel Kahneman in our book on friendship as a kid who grew up he was a Jewish kid growing up in Nazi-occupied France, had no friends. And then he became very famous because of the work he did with his famous friend, Amos Tversky, which won a Nobel Prize. And so we talk a lot about the cooperative nature, but apparently they used to argue with one another too. When I think about my colleagues who I've worked with, Steve and I both work with Steve Newberg, and there's a bit of debating in my lab, and probably, I don't know if there's a bit of debating in your work with Steve, Dave, but it's like, I actually kind of enjoy it because in some sense, I'm around somebody who I trust to disagree with me in a respectful way. And I need it because it helps me hone my game, in the game that I'm in, publishing research articles. It's like, you better know what the reviewers are going to say in advance. Don't send it in and let them batter you.
Right.
Show it to a friendly colleague who will honestly, help you, spar with you about it. So I think actually,
I think Amanda Kirsch is doing some research on it, but I think it's not quite on things, right? But it's not published yet. So maybe next year you should have her on a guest.
Yeah.
Okay.
I definitely see that there's a lot of things to it. I think there's some element for pushing each other cognitively. I think there's some cognitive development if you're a child, but then also to continue to push one another cognitively. I think there's a cooperative aspect. I mean, you mentioned the right thing, Doug. I think that you have to kind of know and trust that person. So, okay, we're gonna intentionally, spar with one another, but it's not going to be malicious or personally damaging, making these kind of attributions about the person of who you are, things like that. So then there's a kind of it's like a sort of guardrails that are set in place. So then you can say, okay, well, we can actually do some of these things, and we can have that. And I think it still is this kind of maybe like a type of it's almost like a respect thing almost, that like, the people I respect the most are the ones that I can tell them they're being a fucking idiot, right? That's the one I respect the most because it's, I respect a lot of people obviously, but I respect these people more because it's, you can hear hard truths and you can tell me hard truths, or we can disagree about something, or we can try and understand our passions or our intentions or our motives. And that's you're developing some sense of intimacy. You're developing something where it's saying, look, I'm really curious about what you think. And especially if you see something. I have a really good friend of mine, and, we are very much, very similar in a lot of things, definitely politically. I mean, I think, which is insane because I get people tease me about being the moderate forever, right? And that's just because I've been on both sides of things. But so I'm kind of moderate liberal, and him and I are. I mean, I can read an article, or I can read something, and I can know almost exactly what he's going to say because that's usually where I'm at. It's so wild, right? And I will always joke with him. I'll say, one of these days we're going to find a thing that we definitely disagree on. And I can't wait for that because I want to have that conversation, but when you think about it, it's like, well, why, right? This kind of, this tug of war, this, kind of tussling about. And I think it's just a way also of the kind of the cognitive piece of like, you're growing and learning from someone you trust, and you're knowing them much better. And so I think if you can, in a sense, a type of practice of sorts, kind of like what both of you were saying, of, well, if I can disagree with this person, I can do it in a safe way, and we can be okay. Maybe I can learn that skill of doing that with other people. Granted, there's other people or different relationships and different dynamics, but maybe I can learn how to kind of sit with it a little bit better. And so it's it's a two-way street. It's good for you. It's good for the other person, and there's all these kind of things at play. So again, it is I think a very good question in ways of how can we do, good science and research to figure that out. And so, definitely something I'll have to ask Jamie about too.
No. Well, also you thought about mentioned the science thing. I think it's kind of interesting. So evolutionary psych has had a lot of people attacking it over the many years that I started getting interested in the early 70s, and people first thought, oh, that's like some form of fascism. It's like you're, just saying, justifying white male privilege. They didn't use that exact term then, but there was, it was this, and a lot of, and that also it's untestable, it's unprovable, it explains everything, and people would just come all after it. And in some sense, they were doing us a favor because they forced us to get research. They forced, people used to say, well, this or that is only an aspect of American culture. And so one of my most cited studies, I had to go out to a number of different cultures and show the same thing. Men, being attracted to relatively younger women, and only as they age, not when they're very young. And I had to go to a number of societies to show this is the feature of American society. So the arguing, in some sense, in the science world, arguments they sometimes are stated in not the most warm and friendly ways, but they do kind of strengthen you. And so the best thing is to have, when you have a warm and friendly critic, that's even better, because then you don't take it offensively and you don't, trade these, to the person kinds of criticisms. But you say, all right, you don't agree with me, I better come up with some stronger evidence on my argument. And that's, that's a good thing. It's especially good when it's done in a friendly spirit.
Yeah, I think if it's constructive, I think it's super helpful. And sometimes you have to, I've had conversations where I've had to remind the person sometimes, like, hey, wait. I'm definitely, I know how it kind of can sound. I'm not attacking you. I'm really just trying to get at this, one point or whatever.
Right.
And I usually will ask a lot of too many and many obnoxious questions of, kind of like, I try to stay curious about the person to say, I really want to know where this is coming from first, because I think it's a terrible idea. So before I shit on it, let me try and understand where is this coming from? How emotionally attached or invested is this person? Because if they are, then I'll ease up a little and I'll say, okay, I have strong opinions in the opposite direction, but I want to be mindful that this is doing more than just a cognitive exercise. There's a lot of things here, right? Or if there's certainly an experience the person has with this idea, I definitely will try to be, mindful. I'll say I'm not going to be overly cautious. I'll just be mindful and say, okay, how do I want to navigate this? And sometimes it won't be that way, right? It really will just be on the ideas, and it'll be okay. We can, well, that's stupid. Like, well, why would you think that way? Like, how did you get there? It's like, well, I don't even know. I just always thought of it that way. It's like, well, maybe this or whatever. So I think it just kind of depends on the person, your dynamics, and sometimes how, if there's experiences or emotional things attached to it, that can kind of muddy things. So I think that's also important to keep in mind. The other thing you guys talk about, we can talk a little bit about him. So I've had him on the show. He's someone that really impressed me. Obviously his work is great, but just how, quick everything was right there, just right at the top, really blew my mind. So Joe Henrich, he's wonderful. He's very, very smart. He's just got it all right there. It's just all right at the surface. So he's written a lot about prestige and dominance, and he even has some ideas in the last book, the Weird Book, right? The weirdest people in the world, about the role of religion and religious spread contributing to things like certain types of companionships and certain types of marriage and things like that. So you just kind of talk about some of his work. I know you mentioned the book of, prestige and dominance and some of the role that maybe, religion had in some aspects.
I know Joe. So I used to go to UBC. In fact, for the last 22 years, I've gone almost every summer except the 2 COVID years. And so we even filmed him for our social psych book. I don't know that we actually used that when we were talking about dominance.
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
But so, yeah, I'm real familiar with that. And I was on one of his students' doctoral. Joey Cheng does research on dominance.
Nice.
And,
very nice.
She's kind of taken that. He's not so interested in that anymore, and she's kind of taken over the dominance and prestige stuff. So you had asked,
violently.
What's that?
She overthrew him. She threw him out a window and said, "Now I'm the leader." So
yeah. Well, no, she's the prestige-based approach. She gathered a lot of data to support it. So, and then one of my students, Adi Wiesel, was actually doing research on dominance, and she's very interested in the question of how, so let's first talk about what those things are.
Sure.
Pathways to status in human beings. And Henrik and Gil White's idea was that, in other species, it's quite clear that dominance is a pathway to getting resources and getting status in, say, chimpanzees or baboons. Right? And by dominance, what they mean is kind of willingness to act aggressive and to be sort of a big bully, more or less. And so I have one concern about that as a personality psychologist. Dominance doesn't actually mean that when you actually look at the personality world, that dominance refers to something a little bit more like Bill Clinton, than like Idi Amin, it refers to sort of confident, extroverted behavior, and negative version of it, and the positive sort of sweeter version of it. But for the moment, let's put that aside. That definitely that is the case. That's a way to get power when you are a chimp or a baboon. And when you're a human, it also works. There was Idi Amin. There have been nasty dictators throughout history who have used power and threat to move up in groups. But what they point out is that human beings also, given that we're a species that exchanges information, they were the students of Rob Boyd, and Rob Boyd is into sort of cultural evolution and very, very interested in the question of how human beings exchange information with one another. That what gets you prestige in a human group is having some skill or knowledge that the other members want to get. And so Boyd's favorite example is building a canoe. It's very hard to build a canoe. Mm-hmm. If you know how to build a canoe, other people want to be near you. They want to learn how to make the canoe. But that's a little different than being dominant. You get elevated in the group, and you get resources, and you increase your access to mates, all the things that dominance does for a chimpanzee. But you get it not by scaring and threatening. You get it by basically having information and being willing to share that with the other members of the group. And so that distinction is a very nice one. And Joey Cheng has done a lot of research, and so has John Maynard, who's a climbing partner of Dave's, but he's now at Florida State. Both Joey Cheng and Maynard have done a lot of research looking at this in organizations, and they definitely do seem to be two pathways to power that both sort of work. There's a few differences between them. And one is that if you get power by being threatening and dangerous, people avoid you. And they're okay as long as you're doing really well and gaining, if like you're a general and you're winning, okay? But you start losing, okay? You start not for the rest of the group, and they want to topple you. There's a lovely book by Richard Wrangham called The Goodness Paradox, and he talks about the fact that if you look at other societies, guys that are bullies, they're not rare, but they're often excluded from the group. People band together to push them out of the group, and sometimes to even kill them. If the guy is being nasty enough, he gets assassinated. Nobody ever assassinates a prestige-based leader. Okay, and in the real world, if you think about an organization, so my student Adi Wiesel has done research asking people, to think of a leader, and either a dominant leader, and we don't use the negative connotation, but think of someone who is, has a lot of power and other people don't get in their way. Or we have them think of someone who is looked up to by the other members of their group and is, considered prestigious. And we find that in both cases, they think of men more than women, especially for the dominant version, but even for the prestigious version. But then we ask them, would you like to work for this person you just imagined? And if they thought of a male, we then later have them think of a female and do the same thing. Would you like to work for this person? Among the questions that we ask. And it turns out that even though people spontaneously think of alpha males, the kind of the dominant chimpanzee type as the stereotype, they think of males in that role of dominance, and they even think of males being more prestigious. They don't have a preference to work for males, for one. They have a preference, not a strong one, to work for females. And they have an extremely strong preference to work for a prestige-based leader rather than a dominant leader, because they don't trust the dominant leader to do them right. So our piece of advice at that part of it, we talk in the chapter on leadership about a number of things, how to pick an occupation, and Dave has a pretty good piece of advice on that.
I can say that after. Okay.
Okay. Well, all right. So how to pick it? All right. I'll
say that
finish. How to pick an occupation? How to do well once you're in that occupation? How to, if you want to be a leader, how to sort of move up in the organization, and how to be a team player. And at the end, when we talk about how to be a leader, we strongly argue you should, if you can do it, if you have the knowledge, go for prestige, not for dominance, because then your other group members will trust you and they'll want to keep you in the position of leadership. But I wanted Dave also had some advice on choosing an occupation.
Sure. Well, so this is, I think, what my dad is leading towards, which ties into all of what he was saying about the prestige and dominance, but in a way which I'll get to in a sec. But it's one of the things we say in the book is sort of this idea of, when you think about these 7 motives again, and you're choosing a career, think of ways you can help other people achieve these motives, right? And so again, there's survival, protection, friendship, status, finding a mate, keeping a mate, and having kids. So you are dominant, right? But you're like let's say you're strong, right? Like that is a thing people still like in times of war, right? But they also like learning these sorts of things. You can have prestige by showing people ways to be strong, and you can have prestige by keeping other people safe, right? And so there are ways you can sort of help people achieve all these different goals. I think that is a good way to sort of achieve prestige and a good way to pick a career.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely ideas. I'm reminded of, it's funny, Doug, when you were mentioning, when people think about leaders of prestige, the first person that comes to my mind is not a male. It's more recent, but I think of Angela Merkel. That's the first person that came to mind. Mostly because, she was around for a long time. And she really helped, Europe weather some pretty serious tests over, the early 21st century that we've been going through. So, and she used, I think, her, she's kind of she has my moderate sensibilities. I have few disagreements with her, but for the most part, I think she was, very stable for Germany, and Germany definitely needed a period, I think, of that kind of stability. But I think that there's usually you have kind of transactional leaders, and then you can have transformational leaders, right? And so, people can think of, President Obama. He's kind of a transformational type of leader. That style of how he led, and you can, think of other folks that have done this as well. And I think it's important to understand, or for people to understand that what prestige and dominance are not, people should not make any moral attributions on them. Both could be positive and both could be negative, right? And, at the same time, maybe, that we use their tools, their skills, and some have maybe more proclivities to one than the other, but that they are helpful and useful. And yes, there are darker sides to them, but that it's not a kind of an all or nothing type of thing. I guess the final thing I want to ask about is, final kind of topic is about romantic relationships and dating and sexual preferences and all these things. So it's just a real light and easy topic to land us home with on the conversation. But
light and easy, huh?
Yeah, so simple.
Yeah.
So light and easy
for you.
So there's been a lot of research on these topics. I guess I'll just kind of give a pretty open-ended. What is the thing in the book that you guys are trying to say about the evolutionary model of pair bonding and of attraction and of sexuality, and then how do we understand that kind of in the 21st century, whether that's different types of relationship status and monogamy and polygyny and things like that, or just in general. So what is your guys' kind of big thing you're trying to express on this topic in the book?
I'll let you go first on this one, Dan.
Well, actually, I was going to let you go first. But I'll go first. I've done a lot of research on mate selection criteria and on sex differences in mate selection criteria, which used to be controversial. I think are much less controversial these days. But part of our advice to some extent is just in some sense it's practical. One of the pieces of advice I got from Norm Lee, who did some research on sex differences with me, was, pay attention to sex ratios. If the sex you're interested in is found in a greater density in one place, you're better off going to that place if you can afford to do that. Go to a place, but if you're a male, go to a place with a high percentage of females, likewise, probably if you were a lesbian, that would be a good place to go to too. And so that I think is one sort of practical bit of advice. Another one is, to be aware of the fact that men and women do have different criteria, and they are, they're things that we kind of have to live with in some sense. We don't necessarily have to laud them or applaud them, but realize that when you're looking, if you're a heterosexual, you look at a member of the opposite sex, they're not, when it comes to mate acquisition, they're not wired up exactly the same as you might be. Okay, so males, for example, are more comfortable with promiscuity than on average than females. Well, it's not true of every male and every female, certainly, but there is that gender difference, and males get themselves in trouble when they make the assumption, if you're thinking women are just as inclined towards promiscuity as you are, and I actually think, we don't talk about this in the book, but I think some things can lead you to a deception in the modern world. You can look at pornography and think there's all these beautiful women out there dying to have sex, right? But in reality, in a everyday relationship, the female is more reticent about getting involved because of parental investment issues. And men should understand that, or they're going to get themselves in danger with sexual harassment or, date rape or something along those lines. But I'll switch to Dave now, and he can talk about some other things.
One question, real quick, Dave, before you jump in here. I guess either one of you can tackle this. Some people will hear what you're saying, Doug, and they'll say, listen. I don't know if I'm all on board about there's certain sex differences, right? Like, I don't know about that, right? Some people will question that, right? I guess the question I have is, keeping that idea in mind, or folks that kind of, have a quizzical look on that, how can we understand sex differences between, men and women in various ways and still have a not only aspirational but concrete goals for equality? How can those two live in the same world?
Well, I think when people typically talk about equality, they're talking about equal access to job opportunities.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
They're not talking about equal access to promiscuous sexual pairings. Okay?
No, not in that way. But some people will get uncomfortable with the idea that, well, women are on average different than men in certain domains, and then how that will translate.
Therefore, maybe they're different in all ways, and so is that the thing you're concerned about there?
Yeah.
That people will jump to a conclusion that, well, because there's this difference, then all traditional sex differences are natural and fine.
Right.
And yes, and in some sense, that requires people to think a little bit more articulated, way about, let's separate, first of all, desire for resources and ability to work well at jobs from desires for what you want in a dating partner. And and I would say that the research on dating partners, it's just so powerful. I mean, there's been decades of research that's been done all around the world. There's certain kinds of general sex differences. Now, one could argue, and in fact, that there are some exceptions to this. Okay. Some people are interested in the same sex. Okay. And that's found universally. But even there's some very interesting stuff. So we did some research looking at men's preferences for other men. And guess what? Men are interested not in the same thing women are. If it was just, homosexual men, the old view in psychology used to be, homosexual men have female preferences. They're, not at all. Females are interested in high status, slightly older males. They put resource acquisition above physical attractiveness. Gay guys are interested in youth, good looks, and a nice body. It's almost as if when the switch gets thrown in your brain to be interested in the same sex, all the other switches that are looking for a fertile young female partner stay in there. That's one of the kind of interesting things about thinking in an evolutionary perspective. We think about modularity. The brain, some of the old mechanisms continue to persist, and for gay guys, it's an interesting problem because as they get older, if you're an older heterosexual man and you get divorced, you have a chance of getting a partner. If you're an older gay guy, a lot of old gay guys talk about this, you get lonelier and lonelier if you're just living a promiscuous lifestyle because the young gay guys are like the young heterosexual guys. They're interested in other young people. Okay. And so I think it actually helps, even if you have a different choice of what you're ultimately interested in, to think about this in an evolutionary perspective. Dave is about to speak.
Yeah. So I do want to say, so I think, while I do think, it is really, really useful to understand differential parental investment and how that affects people on average. I think that one of the other reasons that it even makes me uncomfortable to hear guys always want this, women always want this, right? I think sometimes it can lead to this feeling. Well, I've heard people who say, as a guy, it is my job to objectify a woman and it is her job to try to resourcify me, right? And that it's like this battle of the sexes sort of thing. And I think two things that I personally think are really key to the idea of this book with these 7 fundamental motives, right? One is, I do think that it's the reputation for evolutionary psych is life is all about surviving and reproducing, right? And first of all, any decision you're going to make is going to have trade-offs, right? If you pursue every sexual opportunity, you might be causing some real problems in other aspects of your life, right? And then the other thing that I would want to stress, going back to almost the Mr. Rogers, you're unique and that's what makes you special aspect, is that there's a reason that I don't know if a reason gives it, it's sort of, I don't know, but there's big benefits for a society to be diverse, right? And so for a genetic population to be diverse. And so I would say, I would want to be real careful about people hearing, oh, guys do this and guys do that. You know, guys already, when my kids are in high school, guys and girls both, they already get pressure to like, have you hooked up with, not even have you found a specific person you like, have you hooked up with any person of the opposite sex, right? Like this sort of idea of like, you have to hit these milestones, you know, and, you know, girls get this immense pressure to look, you know, like an Instagram model. And there's a lot more to it. And in fact, my dad's lab has some research showing that when people are actually asked what is the most important thing in your life, mate selection is almost not, it's not that high, right? And so there were basically three things in there, but essentially it's like, yeah, just because these are differential parental investment does mean there's going to be a cost for women to have heterosexual sex. And I think it's really important for guys to be aware of that there's a real reason that they're not going to want to just have a random hookup. And it's probably useful for women to understand that that's not the same for guys. But I also don't think that means that people should then feel they have to go out and live those gender differences, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It certainly does. I think the other thing that's kind of connected to this, and of course there's much more to say about dating and things like that and romantic relationships, but just I guess the idea of, you know, again, another big topic, but just your brief comments on, you know, how do we understand family in the 21st century? It's actually something that Doug kind of mentioned it maybe unconsciously in the beginning, or not necessarily connected, but this idea that we can live far away from our kin now, right? And we didn't used to do that for a long time, right? And I think with most people, you know, that are listening, it's certainly true for me. You know, most of my family lives in, you know, 10 different states, including my immediate family. You know, my dad lives close by, but my mom lives in one place, my brother lives in one place, you know, very far. They're plane rides away, and then extended family is all over the place. The plus side is that when I'm ever in another state or something, I always got someone's couch or spare room to crash on. But, you know, aside from that, really though, is even in my lifetime, you know, I'm obviously not that old, but when I was younger, you know, much of my even extended family lived somewhat closer. We all kind of live in the same area on both sides of my family. And now it's certainly not that way. So maybe just idea of where's family going in the 21st century and how that looks a little bit different from how it has been, you know, for many, many years.
So, you know, obviously we are getting more spread out. What is nice is looking at technology is we will hopefully have easier ways to get from place to place and easier ways to communicate. But when it comes to friendship, I know there's research that in-person friendship still really is the way to go. And I think that with family, well, I don't know that we have specific research on that. I still suspect that there's a lot to be said. And I know from my own personal experience, there's a lot to be said to living close to your family. And I think, like everything else, that's one of those things that people should weigh. So like Norm Lee had research that men should move to a state where their mating prospects are going to be better. I don't know that people should pick up and move to Surf City just because they hear there's 2 girls for every guy. You know, maybe it's better to just stay around your nieces and nephews and help. Because that's one other thing is, I think the way the modern family has changed is, for a lot of people, friend groups. This is not new, but I know, there are a lot of people where they live from their family, and so they'll be a part of sort of a mom's network or a dad's network or a parent's network, and they'll all help each other. And those sort of makeshift families, they really matter. They really, there's stuff on how grandparents help. There's stuff on how, so having those groups and also embracing those roles. If you want to stay in town to help your neighbor raise their kids, go for it. That's a great way to live a life. Mm-hmm. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's two things that in some sense, I think that one of the messages we have is keep your kin close. And in some sense, that's a little bit of a message that goes against, saying, let's just do it the way we're doing it. Let's justify it. I often see these articles in the New York Times that say, one the other day was arguing about mothers having attachments to children as somehow that keeps women down. It's like, but to some extent, you got to acknowledge a little bit of nature. When Dave's first kid was born, his mom moved from Pennsylvania or wherever, from back east somewhere to here. His mother-in-law moved from somewhere, Texas, to here. And I've been delighted. I was someone who ran away from my family, because they were crazy living in New York, and they weren't really crazy, but they were.
Do you mean us? Do you mean somebody else?
No. I don't mean you. I mean
for listeners back home. He means the generation before.
Right, the generation before I ran away from my, crazy family, many of whom went to Sing Sing. But then I sort of, I was very happy when Dave moved out here later, because me and his mom had split. I was happy when he moved back out here, and I'm happy to have his kids around. I'm happy, my younger son, now the people he likes most in life are Dave and Dave's two kids. And it's like, look, that's when you can do it. Do it. Mm-hmm. Of course, when you can't do it, this is a good use of technology. Mm-hmm. So my younger son, he's now in college, but he's at this college, thank goodness for me. But still, he texted me twice during this, one about his psychology course, and I'm happy to get that. I think this is a good use of technology, that to keep in touch with your relatives, to use. I really like it. I love Zoom and, the FaceTime thing where I can actually see the faces when I'm not around my family members. I like to see their faces. That's a lot nicer than the old phone used to be. And so I think we can, use technology. It is, a good use of airplanes, So I guess what I'd say is that being close to your kin and then trying to be as psychologically close to your kin as you possibly can.
Yeah.
We have a couple of other little things there which I think are useful. So I was just looking at that chapter again. One is that we have a lot of step relatives now, and mostly, there's some research on homicide among step, but it turns out that most step parents are pretty nice, but they need to be thanked. Kids need to thank them. Kids have a tendency to make the stepfather like the biological father. It's useful for them to know, thank the guy, because he doesn't have a genetic interest in you. And then your biological relatives, when your mom helps you, thank her. She doesn't need it, but she won't mind it. And so a lot of the same things we do to our friends, do it with your relatives. Treat them politely, and because they can move away and they can cut themselves off from you now. And so it's good to nurture those relationships as much as you can.
Yeah, just to sort of add one last thing to that sort of idea. I think a lot of times people think about, well, there's kin care, and then there's also these sort of through marriage and thinking about step parents. And so like there are sort of modern cultural ways to sort of join families. And I think both of those are things that it's really good to take seriously. My kids, their stepdad is such a great influence in their life. Like he's like this escape. He's like, I don't know. He's just somebody where I'm like, given that, my kid's mom and I are divorced, having a stepdad in your kids' lives that like you trust and that is like, oh my gosh, it's the best thing ever. And so I think all those sort of family relationships are things that
you should send him a thank you note, Dave.
I should. Well, maybe if he's listening, thanks, Mike. But honestly, I think, and Carol, my stepmom, I think she's helpful. And so it's like incredibly helpful. And so I think that whatever somebody's family looks like, I think stick together, that's one of the things we talk about. I think there's a lot of, in modern culture, this idea of sort of immediately thinking of family members as culture and sort of going your own way. And sometimes that might be right for people, but I also think there is a lot to be said for trying to sort of work through things with both the people that you are related to by blood or by bond. I don't know what the other version is, but
yeah, that's nice. Yeah. Can I bring it back to one thing you asked about before? The difference between our pyramid and Maslow's is I think I might have said this briefly, but self-actualization was a little bit self-centered. Okay. It was like, you could reach a point where you no longer need to deal with social relationships. Now you can move up and play your guitar or write poetry or, those are the examples he used, or paint your paintings by yourself and not have to worry about. And what we found in our research is there's no such a thing. Self-actualization exists. We do want to better ourselves, but we want to better ourselves in order to be connected to other people. And so, I think that's one of the things we've learned in the last, 20 or 30 years of research on human evolution is that we are whatever negative characteristics we do have this tendency to be group-oriented organisms, to care about others. And we should let that out. We should not strive to be individuals separated from other people. We should ask what you can do for the other people in your life, not just what others can do for you. To badly paraphrase John F. Kennedy.
Well, it's funny. My last question was really on that, but I think you summed it up well. It really was, if you guys want to final thoughts, but I really think that's a nice summary. Is you guys have so many ideas in the book, and you have so many things that you're discussing as it is, right? You're talking about evolution, you're talking about many different components. And the key takeaways from the book. So I think you summed it up nicely, Doug. But is there anything else you want to say, or Dave, just kind of best things to get?
Hold the book up and say, you can't see it. You can't even see this because you're not going to use the video. But I would say buy a copy of the book for a close friend or relative, and hopefully it'll help them in some way.
Yes, of course. Dave, anything you want to say?
I just want to add, I thank the step-parents. I also want to thank my mom who's watching my kids so I could do this. So thanks,
that's
Mom.
great.
So,
there you go. That's great. That's great. Well, look, the book is Solving Modern Problems with a Stone Age Brain, Human Evolution, and 7 Fundamental Motives. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you, your work, and online, and any relevant places?
So you can find the book on Amazon, obviously.
You can you should be able to find it at your local bookseller as well. So I know Amazon did a bunch of copies, but according to the publisher, that should be available at most.
The publisher's APA books. So if you're a psychologist and you belong to APA, you can get it with a 50% discount.
Very nice.
Or I know if it's a 50%, 25, it's something. It's a big cut for anybody who happens to be an APA member.
Nice. And where's the best place to find both of you guys, whether it's online or university based or your research, anything?
So the ASU has our contact info, so you can always send us an email. You can find me on Twitter at Lundberg-Kenrick because I have a hyphenated last name. You can just.
And I have a page at ASU. I also have a blog that I do for Psychology Today called Sex, Murder, and the Meaning of Life. And that's the progression of my research over the years. I started off studying sex and murder, and now I'm grappling with the meaning. Before I die, I'm grappling with the meaning of life.
Or if people are in Tempe, Arizona anytime, they can come knock to us in person, which, as we've been saying, is always the best way to see people. So
that's true. That's true. In person is always, you can't replace it. Well, look, Doug and Dave, it was so wonderful to talk to you guys for a couple of hours. They always go fast, and it was such an enriching conversation. You guys are both obviously very brilliant, but it's such a real delight to talk with and to have a wonderful conversation about all these things. So I can't say enough thanks for your time and energy and your passion for what you've been studying.
Thanks for the conversation. You're good. It's good talking to you.
Yeah, this was so fun. So we'd love to come back anytime. So thanks.
Of course. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Sure. We'll see you later.